There may be a new A.J. Brown type of trade for general manager Howie Roseman to make for the Philadelphia Eagles this offseason. Who is it for? We'll get into that coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in, Eagles fans. I'm Louis DiBiase, co-host of the Locked On Eagles podcast, Eagles analyst. Also over at Bleacher Report, he's Gino Camilleri, our scouting director, my co-host, and also an analyst for the Eagles at Bleacher Report. On today's Locked On Eagles, we suggest a massive trade for Howie Roseman to make who the top free agent signings should be for the Eagles next week after a flurry of franchise tag moves and extensions this week, and we discuss what kind of wide receiver 3 we want to complement Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day, and today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 back if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And, I teased it, Gino, but of course it's on the side. So for our YouTube viewers, they already knew what was coming. But we've discussed all offseason the need for the Eagles to invest big assets on defense, especially through the draft and top-tier free agents that are young and in their prime. Even if it costs a lot of money in top draft picks, you have the draft capital to do it. 4 picks in the first 3 rounds. You have a lot of cap space to go out and sign free agents that are in Tier 1. And we talked a lot about draft and free agency, but we've mentioned trades before too. And now that this week we've seen a lot of franchise tags being placed on certain stars, that doesn't always mean that guy's going to be with that team long term. There's a lot of times teams prefer the tag and trade option. We saw that toss around with, L'Jarius Sneed last week for the Kansas City Chiefs. Well, this week our guy Brian Burns from the Carolina Panthers got franchise tagged. And the difference with him versus other tags, like Michael Pittman, for instance, got tagged by the Colts. He's not going anywhere. But with Burns and Carolina, they also halted contract negotiations. So this thing is kind of at a stalemate. Could he be somebody that could be had for the right price? They may have regretted back in the day when they denied the Rams trade of 2 1s and a 2 for Burns. He might be available this time and maybe for cheaper because they have no leverage.
I want to first start by saying that, yes, you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, we have to trade for this guy and give up assets, and then we have to extend them. Well, folks,
I've gotten a lot of that
A.J. Brown a couple of years ago, and that worked out pretty well. I mean, you can't do one thing and then be scared to do it another time, especially for elite football players. And the idea of adding Brian Burns, especially with the unknown of Haason Reddick, I think it's a great idea because could you potentially swap Reddick and take down the draft pick value, and maybe you get Burns for Haason Reddick in like a 3 or something, or a 2 and a 3 maybe. But I think the idea of adding a prime edge defender who can both get after the quarterback, can stand up and cover for you when necessary, fits that new hybrid type of edge player that Fangio is going to covet. The idea of picking an edge at 22, I think it is logical. It makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, 1 stone in hand is better than 2 in the bush. The known commodity of Brian Burns is so much higher than whatever a Jared Verse or a Latu is going to present to you within the first year or 2, in my opinion, especially where the Eagles are from a window perspective. Brian Burns, he doesn't change the overall age of this roster. He fits right in as a young foundational piece. Yep. If you were going to make the trade for Haason Reddick, you're probably going to have to replace him anyway in the draft and or free agency. Well, you might be able to do one by doing the other. By moving Haason Reddick, you could potentially add Brian Burns, and or you move Haason Reddick and then get the capital to go acquire Brian Burns. But to have this on the table, 1, Carolina, what are you doing? And 2, Josh Sweat and Brian Burns, the FSU connection. You talk about combo. Our guy. How many times do we talk about drafting Brian Burns?
We wouldn't shut up about him. In the 2019 draft, we would not stop talking about him. And as you mentioned, he's a 25-year-old player in his prime that hasn't even really hit his ceiling. 46 sacks in 5 years, 7.5, then 9 again, 12.5, then 8 sacks this past year. I don't think, again, he's really even hit his full ceiling, yet he has those numbers. He's had the 4th most quick pressures in the entire NFL since 2019. So talk about get off, raw athleticism and speed, bend, length. Like, he has all the traits that you would possibly want. I don't know why people on Twitter were fighting me on this. It's like, have you seen the AJ Brown trade and how that's worked? Like, sure, is it a lot to give up $20+ million and let's say it takes a first round? It's not going to take 2 1s and a 2 like LA offered Carolina. They're not getting that anymore. But if it costs you the 22nd overall pick and a big contract, yes, is it a lot to give up? Sure, but it's for a premier player in his prime at a very important position. I would do it. It's worked out the first time on offense. Maybe it's time to do that for the defense.
And I'm sure the listeners are thinking, oh, well, why don't you just take that money and pay Haason Reddick? Well,
yes,
there's
I got
also
that a lot as well.
A 5-year age gap, folks. And the one thing that you have to remember is you pay a player for what he is going to do. And yes, edge defenders can play well into their 30s. We know that. But a 30-year-old Haason Reddick who's been with multiple teams and is looking for another contract, or Brian Burns, who still hasn't hit a ceiling, like you said. Has Haason Reddick hit a ceiling? I think we know what his capabilities are, right? But 5 more years of Brian Burns potentially to have him in your organization over a guy like Haason, I know it's a tough decision, but a business is a business at the end. I love Haason Reddick. He's a Philly guy. He's made so many huge plays for you. But if he wants $25 million at the age of 30 years old, Howie Roseman is not going to be somebody that does that, especially after the mistakes of Alshon Jeffrey a couple of years ago, of Darius Slay, of James Bradbury. Those things are in the back of his head when he's making these decisions. They want to get younger, more physical, and more athletic. I just think the idea of Burns or anybody in the draft over Haason, from a business perspective, you have to separate business and the personal.
If he wants 25, So I got a listener that asked me on Twitter that same question. Like, wouldn't you rather just take that money and pay Reddick, keep that first round draft pick, and boom, there you go, you move forward? Like, sure, if I could get a middle ground type of deal for Haason Reddick, and you can tell me that they're going to use that first round pick to go get a corner, absolutely. But I don't think that they're going to find that middle ground with Haason right now. I'm not feeling great about it after hearing the comments during the combine. And the good thing is, too, yes, you might have to give up a first-round pick and a big contract to Brian Burns, but as you've alluded to already, you could maybe try to use Reddick in that trade or recoup some assets by trading Haason after you move Burns. Like, yeah, you might not have a first-round pick. You're not getting a 1 for Haason, but you already have 2 second-round picks. You might be able to get another for Reddick and more, or a third-round plus. So you're still, even if you trade for Brian Burns, you're going to have a ton of picks on day 2 and day 3 to collect young talent on both sides of the ball that are inexpensive. So I think there is a good middle ground there, and you kind of can have your cake and eat it too a little bit.
And if you were going to present this to Howie Roseman and say, hey, Howie, all right, we're going to go into the draft, and all we're going to have to do is we're going to have to give up Haason, we're going to have to give up a 3, but how we're going to do this is we're going to move Haason, and we are going to acquire that 2 that we had been looking for, because I don't think they fall into the trap of getting a 3, because you could get that 3 for him next year when he does inevitably.
It's going to take at least. And Adam Schefter said today on a radio spot that the Eagles are expecting, if they're going to trade him, it's got to be a second-round pick.
It has to be. And then at that point, you're saying, okay, we're then going to take our 1, right? Forget about the 3 that I said. We're going to take our first-round pick and move it for Brian Burns. But Howie, we're still going to have 4 to 5 picks in the top 100, and 3 to 4 of them can be in the top 55. Howie Roseman signs off on that trade all day long. And Haason Reddick, he is very similar to what Brian Burns does in terms of play style, the role that they're going to fill in the Fangio defense. And at the same time, you also have Josh Sweat on the other side, who we keep forgetting in this equation. Maybe, just maybe, Brian Burns saves you a couple bucks on the pocketbook that you could then go and push towards Josh Sweat. Who knows? I don't know what Brian Burns is asking for.
Well, because you could backload a Burns deal. You can't really do that with Reddick because of the age.
He's going to want that guaranteed money up front for sure. Burns, you're expecting he's going to be here for at least 4 to 5 years.
He's only 25 years old, Gino, and he's played 5 seasons. This is the exact kind of, like, if you're going to go for a top-tier player through a trade, through free agency, this is the kind of guy to do it. So sure, again, if you can say Haason Reddick, he goes out there and sees his market, and he's not going to get 25+ million, and you can get him for 18 to 20 and keep that pick. Sure, I will just take that. We already have the known production. He gets double-digit sacks literally every single year. But I just don't think that scenario's really going to happen. And sure, it's a deep edge class in free agency, but Brian Burns is such a special talent, and he's been a my guy for us for years. So I'm in on this. In a vacuum, even if it took a one in a big contract, I would love Brian Burns. We're going to keep talking top-tier defensive players that could be available this offseason coming up next. Now that the franchise tags have been tossed out there to certain players, who's left for the Birds next week? We'll get into that coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles.
As we roll on, make sure you get buckets and take your shot like Howie Roseman is going to do in this free agent class. But you're going to make your bet over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, the official sportsbook of LOE and the entire Locked On Podcast Network. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins for only an Abraham Lincoln. You can bet on same-game parlays, props, over-unders, whatever you enjoy, they have it. Whatever sport you enjoy, they have it as well. And they have some draft props coming up that we're going to get into as we get closer. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot like Howie Roseman is going to be doing next week. FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NBA, Locked On Podcast Network, and LOE.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, want to let you know that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV on the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. So find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. We're talking big fish on the defensive side of the ball for the Eagles as the tampering window for free agency opens up next Monday. Tuesday, teams can officially start signing players on Wednesday. But again, the flurry of news and reports are going to come during the week. A lot of players got franchise tagged this week. That's why we're talking about potentially trading for a player like Brian Burns. Antoine Winfield Jr. got tagged, Gino. Josh Allen for the Jaguars. Justin Matabuke for Baltimore. L'Jarius Sneed. Michael Pittman. A lot of big names. Even Mike Evans signs an extension with the Buccaneers. Less players left for next week. But I will say there are still some top-tier guys. Now that we've kind of let the dust settle with the tag frenzy, who's your top guy right now to target?
I would still have to say it has to be at this loaded safety class right now.
Yeah.
And there's just so many guys. And, I mean, heck, Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams get released by Seattle yesterday, and it just gets deeper and deeper. And I don't think you're going to have to overpay at this position. And I think the idea of bringing back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson is a legitimate thing that could happen. And I love the idea of it because it fixes so many things. Like, you saw what he could do for you in 2022, and whatever happened between him and Howie and his agent last year, let it be, man.
You don't have to tell me twice for a reunion, man. I love
in
a good
such
Eagles
a good
reunion.
Safety class, he's arguably one that is just as good as anybody, man.
And will be cheaper than other
the Darnell
options,
Savages, and Kyle Duggar gets transition tags. So are you going to even have that option? Do you break the bank with Xavier McKinney, or do you get Chauncey for a little bit less? And I just think his attitude and his mentality to add him with Sidney Brown and Reed Blankenship, man. You already saw him and Reed playing next to each other. Now you have that just go play center field element with Sidney Brown, and you could add somebody in the draft. I think it has to be safety. I love CJGJ, man. We're talking about my guys. Bring him back. I think it's such a smart move.
And we've heard by multiple reports at the Combine that the feeling could be mutual, that maybe a reunion is in the works, that the Eagles do feel like they miss Chauncey Gardner-Johnson a lot, not just on the field. Like, we talk about the talent, of course, 6 interceptions in 2022, was a ball hawk, versatile, played deep safety, played in the slot when Avonte Maddox went down. But it's that attitude, man. I remember watching the Super Bowl, and we both texted each other watching the Chiefs and the 49ers, and we're like, we don't have these kind of dogs anymore in this defense. And Chauncey's got that attitude, that swagger that just makes so much sense for a Philadelphia Eagles defense. And it sounds like the feeling could be mutual, that he might have some interest in coming back. I love that one. And I think it would be way more inexpensive, Gino, compared to like an Xavier McKinney, because he doesn't really have the leverage he did last year with the injury again this season. Played well down the stretch and in the playoffs, but he'll probably have to settle yet again for another short-term prove-it deal.
With how deep this class is, too.
And that, too.
I want to see how watered down things get, because
right.
Who's going to be the first one that signs and then breaks the dam for the rest of the guys? Because if it's Xavier McKinney,
I think it's McKinney,
and he really tops the charts, then you could be like, okay, this might be a little bit pricier than we had originally thought, like the Marcus Williams year and the Jesse Bates contract, for example. I'm not going to hand out that contract to either of those guys, in my opinion, but in this class with how many guys there truly are, I don't think anybody is going to get that deal, especially because the NFL doesn't really value that position that highly. And at the end of the day, could you walk away with a middle-of-the-road starter that's going to be better than Justin Evans, even if you miss on the top 10 guys? I agree, but I think this is a position you have to because of the unknown with Sidney Brown, the unknown at the slot with Avonte Maddox and Zach McPherson, and you need guys that can tackle at the safety position in Vic Fangio's defense. And who is the best tackler for you in that Super Bowl, Lou? I will go back to Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. I will continue to say that he was the best guy there. You continue to add more guys that can do what he does. Safety has to be the move. It has to. Corner, I think they have enough bodies. It's not that great of a class. Linebacker, you can make the argument that they might go heavy for like a Drew Tranquil type, for example, or really shell it out for a Patrick Queen, but safety just makes the most sense in my opinion.
I think so too. And for me, like Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, a top 2 option for me. I do really like the idea of Xavier McKinney though, and he's only 24 years old. He did avoid the franchise tag and the transition tag from the New York Giants. I mean, listen to these numbers from last year. He was PFF's number 1 coverage safety, their number 4 overall safety. Yep. His 49.2 passer rating against was number 1 for free safeties. 3 picks, 11 pass breakups. He's an Alabama guy. I think he makes a lot of sense. But yeah, you're right. Overall, like whether it's McKinney, Gardner-Johnson, I think for safety, and we've said this before on the show, like corner, you can find those prospects through the draft. You have some young talent already in-house like Keely Ringo. Linebacker, there's draft options and tier 2, tier 3 guys that we like. You know, you mentioned Tranquil, maybe Willie Gay or Josie Jewell from Denver. It's safety. This is too good of a class. It's thin in the draft, and you're thin on the roster with an injured Sidney Brown. Like, you're right. You have to – this has got to be the year to do it. And I think I'm very confident that Howie will do it because, again, he's tried to sometimes half-ass at this position, but I just want to keep thinking about in 2022, he did try to get Marcus Williams, and that's the hope I'm keeping.
And then he did acquire Chauncey at the same time.
And yes, and that was a big move. Even though it was in August, that's a splash move.
I think it was our good friend Corbin Smith over at Locked On's Seahawks, and he had to address the Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams releases, and he made a great point. He's like, I think fans really undervalue what safeties do, especially because on the broadcast view, you don't get to see truly what they do all the time. A lot they're out of the screen, and you're like, where the heck is that guy? But you turn on the All 22, and you really see the capabilities of what a free range get from corner to corner, sideline to sideline safety can do for you. And they need to find those guys that are chess pieces. I think they got too pigeonholed at times, especially when Slay goes out and Maddox goes out. And now you're like, Bradbury, does he really play inside or should we keep him outside? And you don't want to have to make those decisions because you want the multiplicity. And Howie Roseman, one thing he always says around draft time is he wants optionality. He never wants to be backed into a corner. And even with one of these moves, who's to say he can't go and potentially target a trade at one of these positions and go after one of these tag guys, Lou? And everything is open right now for Howie Roseman. You have $41+ million already on the cap. You have a boatload of draft picks. I think you have top 5 value-wise for total draft points, if whatever value you look at. And at the end of the day, they still have a good, promising roster where people want to come and play. I mean, people want to come to Philadelphia. It's a long time removed from where we were saying a couple years ago when we did that show. Do guys even want to play here anymore? Yeah. This is a destination to come and play in Philadelphia, man. I think there's a lot of possibilities. Maybe guys fall in love with the idea of playing for Fangio, fall in love with the idea of playing for Kellen Moore and Nick Sirianni on offense. There's a lot of possibilities, but safety first. No pun intended there.
Yeah, literally. Safety first next week.
Safety first, yeah.
No, I totally agree. I want to talk offense a little bit coming up next. We did our mock draft yesterday. We kind of got into the talk of what kind of receiver we want to complement Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. I want to dive deeper into that coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles. Passion, drive, and patience. It's what brings home the winning trophy. It's also what brings home your ride or die and keeps it alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, Gino, so this topic kind of got sparked yesterday from our Mock Draft Tuesday where we were doing outliers and we were kind of talking, not going to say who we picked, go back and listen to the show, but we were gunning for unique players that might not have certain skill sets that traditionally fit that position, but because of that, they might fall down to, later picks and they have other elite traits that could change the position, and it's a rare opportunity to get a really good player. And we started talking a little bit about Johnny Wilson, who I've mentioned a little bit here on the show, Florida State's 6'7" wide receiver. And that started to get me thinking about what kind of receiver we want for Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown as that third guy. Do we want a traditional shifty slot that's a really good route runner? Do we want to bring back the monster slot guy like a Jordan Matthews type of player that they used to have in 2016? Do you want another burner and try again for a better version of Quez Watkins? For you, if there was a style, you could have your pick of the litter, regardless of what players are available, more so style. Who is that receiver you'd want with Smith and Brown? Or, again, what kind of receiver?
I love the idea of the Xavier Worthies, the Troy Franklins, the true burners that can, just get it and go. But at the same time, the Hunter Renfrow, the Ricky Purcell, that, slot receiver can sit there. I mean, you love Curtis Samuel element.
Yeah.
Those guys that they have that gadget element to them where you want to get them in space, but at the same time, they're going to make safeties who are going to line up over them in the slot, or a linebacker in some quarters looks just have a terrible time trying to defend them as a pure route runner, because you want to open up. I think the approach with AJ and Devontae is kind of how Kansas City uses Travis Kelce, where it's you guys are smart, you understand zone, you understand where to sit, you guys just go and manipulate the defense.
Yeah, do your thing.
I want somebody on the interior that can just take advantage of those other two guys getting all the focus and just is as smart as them, because they can just play off of one another like a triangle offense in basketball. That's what it has to be. Build it like a basketball team. I think the best units that you've seen at the wide receiver group, 2017, man, look at how that group is built. You have power forward Alshon Jeffrey on the outside, and then you have Nelson Aguilar, who's more like your swing guy, and then you have Torrey Smith, who's more like your shooting guard that's going to get you down the field. That's the type of setup approach that I want to see this team have, because the 2020 track star, everybody just run down the field, we're going to run nines all day. It didn't work. But AJ, Devontae, they have the downfield element. Give me somebody that can dominate 5 to 10 yards. Then they can eat in the open field areas. I love that idea. But at the same time, you add a Xavier Worthy, a Deshaun Jackson 2.0 to this, Lou. Oh, we might be talking about a crazy offense.
I agree. The good news is, like you mentioned, Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown can do everything. They are deep threats. They're players that can make tough catches over the middle, run after the catch, screen game. You can use them, pre-snap motion. They can do everything. So you have your flexibility of whatever kind of receiver you want to add in this basketball team-like receiving group. You have that flexibility. For me, you mentioned Xavier Worthy. If you could, he's not going to probably go in the second round at this point after breaking that 40-yard dash time at 4.21. But if you can get somebody like that, that's why I had so much hope for Quez Watkins. I think that's just such a perfect element to add to an offense that has two complete receivers. If you have a burner that does not need 5 to 10 targets a game to make an impact, I think that's exactly what this team needs, because you also add Dallas Goedert into the equation. He's another guy that can eat in pretty much every area of the field. I really want that burner. I want to try again for a Quez Watkins type and have that nice compliment. Are you going to go out there and draft Worthy in the first round? Probably not. Are you going to go out there and sign Hollywood Brown to a big contract? Probably not. But if you're thinking third round, let's say a Tez Walker from UNC falls, and somebody that doesn't have a very refined route tree right now, but he runs those vertical routes very well, I think that's the player I want to try again for, but I totally get your logic too of if you could add a Roman Wilson in the slot or trade for a Hunter Renfrow, again, whatever style you want, they need to, no matter what, get a productive player at this position.
I mean, at the same time, why not both? And I also want to say, I think Britton Covey kind of gets the first crack at the role that I'm saying. I think Britton Covey is.
I am interested to see how he plays a receiver. Yeah.
He started to get in there in situations last year. He's a good blocker on the outside, that little Britton Covey. But no, he's that route running element. That's what he did at Utah. Maybe they add somebody to complement him, somebody that's like a bigger slot where you could play both of those guys, and now you have both of those elements. I think don't just get put into one area. Don't pigeonhole yourself. The optionality.
Or that's what happens with 2020, like you said.
Yes,
then you're going for
fall into that trap. You don't want to fall into that trap because in today's NFL, and especially in a West Coast offense that this Eagles team likes to run, right? You like the idea of that downfield element, but how the West Coast offense works is it's front to back.
Right.
So if we can read short to deep, our first looks are going to be, okay, we got these two good route runners in the middle of the field, and Dallas Goedert and whoever else you get. And then outside, well, these guys just have to get open after these guys get the traffic up front, and maybe that is the way to go about it, or you just say, we're going to take deep shots and we just start chucking this ball down.
Yeah, I think there's a middle ground. I think for you, for instance, if you identify you want that shifty slot receiver, that can be a preference, but not have the tunnel vision of 2020 where you're saying no matter what, I'm going to take that player, even if there's a better overall player at the position
or
that
JJ
has different
with that
styles.
big slot type.
That's what I fell victim of is I saw in 2020 they had a Zach Ertz and a Dallas Goedert, and they still had Alshon Jeffrey on the roster. And I'm saying to myself, they have a lot of possession receivers that can eat over the middle and a lot of the areas that Justin Jefferson does well. But when you go too extreme with that, then again, you force a pick like a Jalen Reagor. So the good thing is with wide receiver this year, you already have Smith and Brown, so there's not this pressure to make sure you nail the pick. If you want to go a little more on taking a risk on a fast guy or a shifty slot, you do have that flexibility. But again, you got to just be careful with it, and make sure you're not taking a inferior prospect or free agent.
It's don't force the pick and don't overpick here as well, because at the same element, we talk about all these guys. Are they really going to be your number one or number two? No, they really have to have one or two good traits that they're very good at. So you could locate those guys in day two, even early day three, even heck, maybe late day three, where you're saying, okay, we don't have to invest truly in a Xavier Worthy who's going to get overdrafted because of that 40 time.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody falls that you fall in love with that could fall right into that category. I mean, maybe you love a Luke McCaffrey, for example, or maybe you love the kid out of Holy Cross, or maybe you like some of these underrated guys that you're not going to have to go. The Adonai Mitchells and those type of guys, those guys are going to go way higher than I think the Eagles are going to want to take
I think so too. It's a loaded class this year, so maybe that does push some players like Tez Walker or, Jamari Thrash from Louisville. Might be available a lot later than other classes.
Johnny Wilson might be available where you're talking, Lou.
Exactly. The big 6'7" guy. Maybe they bring back the big people beat up little people thing. Who knows? Let us know what you think. Hit us up on Twitter at LockedOnBirds, at GC24_football, and at DiBiase LOE. We will be back tomorrow. Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. As always, thank you for downloading. Thank you for watching and listening. And let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.